It's a pleasure to have this chance to speak to you about a project that occurred starting in about 2002 and running through till about 2008. The project actually continues, and I'll speak to that a little later on. I wanted to give this presentation for a few reasons, one of which was basically to this next question here. As a School of Tourism and Hospitality Management, we're basically looking to figure out our way ahead in terms of our research agenda. And as with all schools, it evolves, and we look to the expertise we have. But I've highlighted this as one school within a collection of schools. And I think the opportunity for us is that I know that a number of other schools are looking at issues to do with poverty alleviation, sustainability, community development, and we are one of many. And so I think our opportunity is at the end of this presentation, if we take a few moments to maybe think about, perhaps brainstorm, offer suggestions as to how we can collaborate, some things that could be done that we could share and move ahead in terms of maybe insight, development grants, these kinds of things. So that is a question that is in the back of my mind, and I offer it to you because I think there's opportunities that we can all work together. We'll start with this next question to get us in the frame of tourism, because this is really the challenge and also the opportunity with working in the field of tourism is that we can position tourism or tourism can position itself as a destroyer of culture or as a maker or a benefit to culture. And so tourism is a double-edged sword. Tourism has damaged a lot of communities in the world and regions in terms of development, resort development, impacts such as sex tourism, environmental impact, these kinds of issues. These are all ones that may come to mind when we think of places like Phuket or parts of the coast in the Mediterranean, be it on the African side or on the European side. So tourism can bring many benefits to cultures and communities. It also can bring a lot of dangers and problems. And so these are the challenges that we face when we look at tourism. And so when we raise the question of tourism and working in developing countries, it has a long and fairly dark history of basically companies going in and being able to develop as they wish in many parts of the developing world. I would say over the past 10 to 15 years, there's been a change where a number of development agencies have looked at tourism as a means to alleviate poverty. And the thought was, well, tourism being a sporadic and crazy thing, we always talk about the tourism industry. And in fact, it's a fragmented industry. It's not one cohesive voice. It's a whole bunch of small businesses, and then there's corporations that are involved. So it's all over the place. There are world agencies like the World Travel and Tourism Council. There's the World Tourism Organization under the United Nations. But it's a pretty fragmented industry. So over the past, I would say 15 years roughly, there's been more of a trend towards agencies such as CIDA and the Dutch agency SNV and others that look to tourism as a possible venue for creating benefit at a local level. And this term pro-poor tourism started to come up, as if to infer that normal tourism doesn't really benefit the poor. And that is a discussion in itself. But we'll just run with that perception of pro-poor tourism being a form of tourism that actually focuses on bringing net benefits to the poor. So what you see is a movement towards projects, international development projects, having a tourism piece to them. So community-based tourism this is just a brief definition here, and I see a few people here with a lot of expertise in community-based development, community development, and you'll want to take this a little bit further. But just as a working definition, I thought I would present this and to allow us to move into the presentation, the case of Vietnam and what we did there. So it's of course underlined the philosophy of sustainability. It's about getting locals involved and owning businesses. It's about having them be in control of decisions about the direction that their community is taking in terms of tourism. And what I like to think about is it's about having the ability to say no. Because so many development projects, when they come into communities, there's such, the economic opportunity that they represent is so welcome that they often will just take anything. So the ability to say no to projects was certainly something that we felt was important within the community-based tourism work that we did, and I'll speak to that a little later on. This notion of a symbiotic relationship between decreasing risk in communities and then benefiting tourists is one that I just wanted to touch on, because you can look at this particular issue from the perspective of development, and I've listed the Millennium Goals here. We can also look at it from a business perspective in terms of decreasing risk for visitors to come to a place. So if I say, let's go to deepest, darkest Africa, we're going to stay in a community, and we're going to live there for 2 nights, and we're going to eat their food. Some people go, that's a fantastic adventure. I'm all about that. I will go, and I will risk my health for that experience, because it'll be an amazing cultural experience. Whereas others might go, I can't do that. I don't know where the food's come from. I don't know if I'm going, is there going to be bottled water there? Is there going to be the amenities I'm used to? Is there a flush toilet? Can I sit down on the toilet? These kinds of questions come up. And all of a sudden your market decreases. The size of your market decreases. So, and it gets to the point where certain areas are so inaccessible, geographically, and then you throw in all these other barriers around risk to one's health as a tourist that people just don't go there. And some people say, well, that's a good thing. Yeah, well, it is. But if we're trying to actually generate revenue in those communities, then those are just problems, and they're obstacles to having tourism come to a community. So when we look at these Millennium Goals, what I want to point out is that when we see promote gender equality, when we see reduce child mortality, when we look at issues around extreme poverty and hunger, controlling HIV/AIDS, malaria, these somehow, and in some ways directly, in some ways indirectly, cross into tourism development. And so when we look at developing community-based tourism, we have to address a lot of these, what we can call risks, not only for the benefit of the tourists, but specifically for the benefit of the local community. So let's zoom off to other side of the world here, as I try to master the mouse. There we are. And I'm going to start with this old map just to locate ourselves as to where we're going in the world. And this is a map from the colonial period, turn of the century, as in over 100 years ago. And I think it's important to just give a little bit of context to Vietnam and its story that's brought it to where it is. And I typically do this a lot when I'm speaking to my undergraduate students and graduate students, is because the whole notion of where poverty comes from, is one that I think requires, giving this context, particularly for undergraduate students and to a certain extent graduate students. But I'm going to pass by a lot of that because I know this audience is well versed in a lot of those issues. I will just give a little bit of an overview of history of Vietnam in terms of its colonial past. It was French Indochina from about the mid-1800s right through until the Japanese invaded in 1941. In 1941, with the Japanese in town, the Ho Chi Minh continued the fighting against the Japanese, even though the French essentially stopped, and they stayed as administrators for the colony. So Ho Chi Minh was fighting, and he was supported actually by the American government, actively supported, and continued the fight right through till August of 1945, when Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Cong troops entered Hanoi as victors. The war was declared over, and in a parade in August of 1945, he stood up on a podium and he presented the Declaration of Independence, the American Declaration of Independence, which is amazing, to declare Vietnam as independent. And you know, the irony is harsh for what was to come. By the about 1947, the French basically had said that they wanted to come back in as full administrators of the country, and basically landed tanks and troops to enforce that. And in a provisional government with the Vietnamese, it was ultimately overthrown. The French took power again, and what they call the French War started. So right through until 1954, the French were there. The Americans came into the South Vietnam. The country was partitioned from North Vietnam and South Vietnam. And the Americans were in the South, and by the mid-60s, through various incidents, war was declared on the North, a history you well know. And right through until 1975, the war continued. And after the war, we basically had a period where Vietnam closed its borders to the outside world. In 1990, it opened itself up to the world in a policy called Doi Moi, which was an attempt to basically liberalize the economy and look ahead to development opportunities through foreign investment. So there's a shot of the range of the country here. And I don't know, do I have a pointer here? I'm not sure if any of this. We're just going to be up in the very, we're in that country called Lao Cai, or sorry, the city of Lao Cai, right up on the border there. And so let's just offer a few snapshots here. When you go to Vietnam, of course, you're surrounded by all this history, and it makes for fascinating history. When, of course, Ho Chi Minh, as a Marxist-Leninist, he basically did what a lot of communist countries did and put up these amazing statues. And so you have this wonderful statue of Lenin surrounded. Some of these are palm trees in the background, and it still stands in Hanoi. And it's certainly part of the makeup of the country, the whole notion of the government's role in development. What is now a tourist attraction, yet quite another legacy of the Vietnamese struggle and their development is what they call the American War and the French War. So we have museums, we have lots of piles of armaments and bits and pieces from the war. But the thing is that nowadays, the generation that's there, we have 50% of the population of Vietnam under the age of 22. It's a war that they're learning about from their parents. And so in this particular picture, we have students from Hanoi Open University. They are taking their sustainable tourism management program. It's a 5-year program where they learn English, and then they do sustainable tourism, and they do business courses and this kind of thing. And they're in front of a piece of B-52 undercarriage, which is in the pool of water there in the center of Hanoi. And that's from the Christmas bombings of the early 70s. So they're surrounded by this incredible time in the history of Vietnam, yet they are in a different world, and they are looking ahead. They're in a land where American dollars are used in the street. English is the predominant language in Hanoi. They're working to try to get ahead like the rest of us. And so as with a lot of urban centers, people are migrating from rural areas into the urban centers because that's where the economic development is happening. But there's another face to Vietnam, and it's the ethnic tribes that number over 50 in Vietnam. So this is Hmong on the left, and you have Red Zao on the right. If you were to go into northern Thailand, you'd bump into the same cultures. Generally speaking, these are not indigenous to Vietnam. They've come in from China well over 100 years ago. They were refugees into places like Laos, Vietnam, and Thailand, and there is where they settled. They were seen as outsiders to the Viet people, and they were basically left to stay in the country and told to stay in the country in a lot of cases. The areas that are inhabited by the hill tribes are some of the poorest in Asia, and they are definitely the poorest in Vietnam. So, and as you can perhaps guess, with the beautiful headdress that each of these people wears, it's a fascinating culture to learn about. And this is the setting that they live in. This is the landscape, which to me reminds me a little bit about the French Alps. It's an area which is about a night's train ride north of Hanoi, and it takes you into the foot of the Himalayan chain. And so it's this beautiful area of rolling hillside. You can see the rice paddies, and there's various hamlets throughout this valley. And this was made into a hill station by the French over 100 years ago. And they would leave Hanoi to escape to the cool breezes of the mountains. So this is the area that they would come to. What they would do is they would typically hike across the valley and stay in some of the little villages. So nowadays, that's what Sapa looks like. So this is the market town in this particular area. And nowadays, this is a very popular tourist attraction. It's part of Lonely Planet, it's part of Rough Guide, it's part of all the travel books that say, where should you go in Vietnam? And Sapa is in that list. It's a place where people go to trek and to have experiences with the various hill tribe cultures. So here's a person we may all know who's just entered the room. And I showed a picture of him earlier surrounded by street kids, and here he is again surrounded by street kids. Now, if we didn't know who this person was, this kind of scene we might feel a little bit uncomfortable about. You know, young girls, old white guy. They're following him a lot, right? But this is, in fact, yes, he did. And I think what they did is they latched on to Brian because they knew he would buy. And so we would trek, and we would trek all day, and we'd have this entourage behind us of Hmong girls that were trying to sell us things. And but, you know, it's that in itself is a story, Brian's purchasing habits overseas. But this is the town of Sapa, and this is one of the big challenges that we have when we look at tourism. This is the double-edged sword of tourism. So here are young girls, could be in school, they should be in school, and yet they're in the street and they're selling various wares to tourists. This is one of the students that I took over to Vietnam on the project. And he's chatting with them, and they're very well versed in English. Speak English fantastically well because they're interacting with tourists every day. Now, this can be a bit of a problem because a lot of these young girls are coming in from surrounding villages, and once they get to Sapa, it's a long way back, so a lot of them will just find a place to stay. Now, in Sapa, it's basically, as I say, it's a tourist hub. People will go to this town. They'll stay in the hotels. It's about 45 minutes away from the Chinese border. And young girls like this are in incredible risk in this setting, because you know, the classic sex tourism story of wealthy people, be it men or women, mostly men, will come into communities and offer offer money, to these young girls, and the opportunity is too good to pass up. Having been in that part of the world several occasions, well, about 15 times, I've been approached by grandmothers who have offered their children, and so this is again the dark side of tourism, and this is one of the issues that we need to address. Anytime we try to develop tourism, we have to look at the dark side that could come up. Here's a young woman who's actually benefited from tourism. She speaks English. She's a guide, certified as a guide at the state level. She is married. She's 16, decided not to have children until she gets her next level of certification as a guide. She makes about $5 a day. And unlike her younger friends who are just walking the streets trying to sell merchandise, she actually has a career in mind in relation to tourism. She sees that it takes her out of her community, out of her village, where she would no doubt be picking rice, and she finds herself interacting with visitors from all over the world, building her language, working out of the local hotel, and definitely generating more money than she would if she just were to have her rural lifestyle. Again, the double side of tourism, and this isn't, globalization. When we get into globalization, and I think this picture really befits that topic, tourism is on that edge of globalization. People as Westerners going in with digital cameras and equipment and going into these remote communities have an impact, and that is always one of the great criticisms of tourism, is that it can have such an impact on communities and on young girls like these who see people wearing different clothes and have different music and these kinds of things. So some people would argue, well, tourism is bad on culture. It will create a negative impact which will cause this culture to lose its way, will lose its values and beliefs. But you have other forces at work here, and it's a very complex setting. You've got Ho Chi Minh still present up in the left-hand side there, and the values of communism and the role of the state. On the right side there is the newly purchased television that you find in a lot of these hamlets, where they will aim to generate more power just to get that television going. And I'm sure a lot of you have been in that situation where you're in a remote setting and the TV's on and they're watching, like has happened to me, watching a wrestling federation or something incredibly out of context with the setting you're in. And the challenge becomes, well, is that bad or is that good? And who gets to make that decision? Some people would be disgusted, and other people say, well, isn't it up to them? Isn't it their decision to turn that television on and to take that in? Do we have to protect them? So we raise these issues as we go along when we look at globalization coming into these communities, and tourism is part of that. And I think the response to that, from my perspective, is it's about the community being educated and being able to make the decision on how it wishes to change and evolve. So I'll turn to this project. I don't put this project up as a best practice. I think it has some great merits, and we did some good work. I think that it created other problems. When you're at step one, and you go through the first 5 steps, and then you look at step 6, it's a different set of issues. So we evolved these communities in terms of their relationship to tourism, and we had successes, and then we had to go. And then they're saying, well, yeah, but we're here now, and we have all these new problems. We have these other issues to address. So there's a challenge there when you talk about development projects, and it's one that is common to all projects in terms of how you exit in a way that that allows the project to continue, to sustain itself without the presence of foreigners. So the project goal was to reduce poverty in rural communities in northern Vietnam through the training of locals in sustainable tourism-related skills. The purpose of the project was actually to develop the capacity of Hanoi Open University faculty. So we actually worked with the faculty at Hanoi Open University, who you'll meet in a second, to have it so that they would have the skill set, once we left, to carry on this work in other communities, which I will say they have. Here are the partners. We focused on 2 villages because we felt that for the 5-year project that we had, it was funded through the Canadian International Development Agency. We had $400,000. We thought that it would be best spent focused on 2 communities rather than more than that. We picked communities that were at different stages of their relationship with tourism. Tafin was very much in its early days. People didn't really know that it was there. Tavan was much more developed and was receiving a lot of tourists on a daily basis. So there's the range of partners. And this is what we decided to focus on in this project. It was a training project. And so we looked at those communities and we chose them not only because of the different levels of development, but the kinds of needs that they had in terms of training. And this goes back to the Millennium Development Goals. We are focusing on developing locals so that they can interact with tourists and develop entrepreneurial opportunities. The Millennium Goals are about essentially alleviating poverty and addressing socioeconomic environmental issues. You can see how these cross over. Things like food safety is basically about decreasing the risk for tourists so that more tourists would be willing to come and stay in these communities. Things like first aid, definitely something that would benefit a tourist if they had the misfortune of breaking a leg, but it also benefits the local people. HIV/AIDS awareness was certainly about educating youth about the problems with sex tourism. Right? Sanitation and maintenance, it was about latrines, it was about recycling, it was about garbage, and all those basics, which from an aesthetic perspective, when you put your tourism hat on, you're saying, well, you got to have the place looking in a certain way, right? Yet, at a local level, it actually benefits them in terms of addressing issues around disease. Product development, this was an interesting one. This is about entrepreneurship and how to develop a product, how to understand your market, all that good stuff. And so we'll show you what came of that. So when we implemented this project, it always starts with a blackboard and a lot of brainstorming. But I wanted to show the different kinds of people that needed to be involved to make this work. And all of these are stories, and we need to just pass through them fairly quickly. But we had the university with its traditions and values and its attempts to establish itself as an academic institution and to create a faculty that were properly credentialed and that were doing their best in terms of delivering education and conducting research. We had local government folks, a lot of whom were, had no university education, who were basically working in rural areas, dealing with a range of issues, and now tourism was put on their plate too. This is a training we did, of course, involving certificates, which we did over about 3 days and involved looking at what community tourism is and how to bring it about. But when we take a group photo and we actually look at one of these fellows, this is a guy who's looking after about 10 communities, and he was given this fantastic plan written by the French, which Brian was at the great handover, big document. And he came up to me and he said, how do you make it live? That's how he said it. How do you make this live? It was about how do you implement the plan? And he had this thing, and he just looked at it, and this was his area that he was looking after. And he was trying his best. He just couldn't figure out what to do with this big plan. Just didn't understand how it was going. So you get these people, so you have government people that are trying to figure out what to do around economic development and bring around a sustainable form of development. On the other side of the coin, you have tour operators, and these are the tour operators in Hanoi. So if you're a tourist, you want to go and visit the hill tribes, you go to Hanoi and you make your decision there. Right? You go to maybe Handspan, which is a great adventure travel company. They very much into sustainable tourism practices. Or you may find a nice fellow like this who's very friendly, maybe not so much into sustainable tourism, Not sure if he's perhaps heard of it, but he's making a living out of tourism, and his job is to get people on the bus and to sell one of these packages to you. So the whole back end of what's happening in the village is just far removed from this fellow, right? He's looking at how much money he can get out of you to get you on the bus and to run his business. So this is what we call our distribution channel, where we have the community, poor, dealing with a lot of issues, and you have the tourist interacting with the tour operator who's making the sale and bringing people into the village. So this is how the culture is portrayed, right, on a post as a package. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily bad. It might be vulgar in a way, but there are good operators that are doing excellent things. But it's important to recognize that this is how people find out and become aware of Ta Phin, because many of us haven't heard of it. So we go to Hanoi, and all of a sudden we hear about this place. Like, we come here and we hear of Tofino or Coombs, right? It's like, Coombs? Where's Coombs? Right? So all of a sudden we go to Coombs because we hear about it from a local tour operator. So they're an important part of the development of this community. So all of a sudden, our web of training goes out. It's not just about working in the village and having them come. It's not Field of Dreams, right? Build it and they will come. Here's our community. This is Ta Phin, and these are the ladies that make up the tourism committee. And it is all women. The men are nowhere to be seen in this. They are the laborers who are typically doing hard labor. They are riding the motorbikes, going elsewhere. And it's basically the women who are at home and who can build the homestay and who can feed tourists. And so this is the group that we're working with there. Here's one of our faculty members. When we met her, this is Ang. She was about 28 years old. She had 400 students to be responsible for. And this is the legacy of the war. You don't find a lot of doctoral professors in Vietnam to the extent that you would need for a population of 70 million. So she is the new breed, right? She's now in her late 30s. She's working towards her PhD. But this is the face of Vietnam. This is one of the challenges around development. So she is our focus, and her students. So we're dealing with hill tribes and their culture, but we're also dealing with the Viet people and their whole perception of hill tribes. So we have Canadians too. So essentially we have at least 3 cultures going on at any one time. And I just thought I'd throw this picture of Brian in. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to check out the setting in terms of what was happening in tourism in these communities. And this is the risk issue. If you can climb up that ladder, you get to sleep. Okay? There are no lights. It's a very dodgy setting in terms of physical safety. And this is the kind of thing that we were evolving towards. Mosquito nets, we had mattresses, we had materials that weren't so vulnerable to humidity. And basically we looked to get homestays certified in these communities so that tourists could come and stay here. So the certification was through the government. There's a garbage problem. And so, one of the issues was around that in terms of sanitation and maintenance. It was about training the young folks who basically said, I can drop this stuff anywhere, and, that's what we do here. And it was, of course, just simply changing cultural views on that and about enjoying and celebrating the local environment and their community and cleaning it up. So we did a lot of cleaning up projects with the school and having them think about looking at their community differently. These slides are basically just scenes of different issues that we were faced with. In this particular picture, we have a fellow who's making your lunch over a grate. There's no hot water here, and there's lots of challenge for foodborne illness. And so this is basically what we were trying to work with, is we were trying to work with that whole culture of hygiene. Now, a lot of these are, we can go overboard on issues like hygiene, but there's also a whole medical and health, thinking that goes around food safety that we wanted to bring to the communities so that tourists, again, would feel that they were safe. Latrines, these kinds of settings. First aid training, of course, our AIDS awareness. And I guess, it's you can imagine going into a community and saying, okay, we're going to bring in AIDS awareness to the community because it's obvious it's a thing we have to address. But you have the whole cultural perspective on sex to address. And how are you going to do this in a respectful manner? Because it's a challenge, it's a problem, it will kill you if you don't have this knowledge. So this was the thing that we had to struggle with, which a lot of development projects do. And so there's a long and fascinating history with the Red Zao people around their own medicinal practices and the herbs that they use and these kinds of things. So we were learning as much from them as we were trying to teach them. So we brought in first aid trainers, certified first aid trainers, and we ran through a range of things that were delivered in the community by the Hanoi Open University faculty as well as ourselves. Part of the project involved taking over Canadian students to Vietnam, and this is probably one of the things that I would like to see here at Royal Roads, is that whole thing of where we can get our students to have these kinds of experiences, where they're muddy and they're out there and they're doing crazy things. And I know Geoff has done some great work in Tanzania with students, and I think there's more opportunities for us to look into that. Not only were we dealing with issues like the comforts of beds and food and these kinds of things, but we also were trying to think about product. And when we talk about product in tourism, it's usually around culture, and it can be around culinary, it can be around wellness. These days, wellness tourism is a big push, the whole thing of spas. And you work with what you have in these cultures. And so you take essentially an inventory of what is available in the community. What is it that you do here? What are your dances? What are your celebrations? And you essentially try to look at those as experiences that tourists would pay for. And that can seem like you're commercializing, you're commodifying the culture. And to a certain degree, you are open to those kinds of criticisms. I won't shy away from those. However, the upside is that double edge of tourism, where I said, is it a benefactor to culture, or does it take away from culture? In this case, you started to have dances, songs performed by local people that had long been pushed aside, or in some cases, the younger generation just decided to move on from them. They just weren't necessarily engaged in them anymore. So we found that by the time we were coming back in the third year, there was a community dance group that were singing and dancing, and that they were charging for that experience. We had an interpretive center, which is this one here that I just passed, where we basically had the story of the community and how they pick rice and how they live their lives and some of their cultures and beliefs, their beliefs and values. Here we have the code of conduct, which is an interesting exercise in itself, and in tourism, this is one of the necessary aspects of any kind of community-based tourism project. It's basically the rules of engagement with tourists, and they're usually directed specifically at tourists to say this is what you can and cannot do. And so this was the first sign that we developed. And of course, this was an activity that we did with the local people. And this is where we go back to that issue of saying no. Because I find in many parts of the world, people are so friendly and they're, oh no, we love tourists. They give us money and it's all good. We have no problems with tourists. And so this is how the conversation started when we were doing our code of conduct. And after about half an hour of everyone saying they love tourists, then someone finally said, well, there is one thing they do that upsets me. And then all of a sudden, it was like the dam opened. And all of a sudden, it was okay to say something bad about the tourists. And we had a list that was just as long as your arm after a while about things that were of concern. And this was the first effort, but when we went back, we said, okay, we'd like to revisit the code. Is there anything else that you've seen happening in the community that is of concern to you that you want to educate tourists about? And so we basically ended up with this kind of font, right? And we changed the languages. We put it in Vietnamese as well as in English. It needed to go into Spanish and German as well. But it was basically going into brochures and tour operator materials onto websites, basically to educate people as to what they can and cannot do when they go into these remote communities. I don't think tourists necessarily have a bad intent when they go to these communities. They just simply don't know. So cultural impact can occur in the most benign of ways, completely unexpectedly and unknowingly by the tourist. So this kind of code of conduct material is really important activity as well as a way to educate tourists. Here's our certified ladies as tour guides. Young girls who, a lot of them aren't able to finish high school because the family can't afford high school, so they look to become a certified guide. And this is one of the programs we ran. I did actually have a little video which I was looking at earlier and somehow can't find it on YouTube. So I'm sorry we don't have the music and sounds of this area to share with you at this point. This was towards the end of our event. This is the Zai people. They became a third village that we worked with later on. And this is where we closed out our project and reviewed what we had done, talked about the different projects around homestay development or food safety and to get a sense of where we should go from here. We had government people in there. We had tour operators. We had the villagers themselves. And it was a fantastic thing to see, all these different players coming together, at the end of the project to review something and to see where they needed to go next. There, however, had been a change in the guard of some of the government people had left, and there was a new group to educate. And they came in, and when the villagers started to speak, they left the room. They wanted to show that they were the government folks and that they didn't necessarily needed to listen to the villagers. And so, to me, as I walked away, I realized that there was still a lot of work to do around maintaining relationships and ensuring that people understood how tourism worked and understood how different people played a key role in this. I just want to go back to some of the tourists. I'm going to present the results in a second. We've got about 3 or 4 more slides. And these are just a few of the 40 Canadian students that I took over. This is Chris Carnevale, majored in tourism management and now is doing his master's degree in community development at UVic. He spent about 2 years in Vietnam. He went on to work in Tanzania. He did work in Paraguay, and his whole focus is around tourism as a means to alleviate poverty. So he's a new breed of person that's coming out of a program like tourism. And really, I think it points to why when we talk about global tourism management, why we want to do global tourism management. And this is another person that leads us in the work that we tried to do in Vietnam, and she is in Inuvik, Northwest Territories. And her role is Community Tourism Development Officer. And so her name's Jackie Chalice. I met up with her 2 weeks ago when I was at the Northwest Territories Conference as a speaker there. And she's been there 2 years now. She's very influential in the community and in the territory. And the whole focus for her has been around creating a sustainable form of tourism that benefits the people in the community, and that helps to alleviate a lot of the issues that we may see in Vietnam, but we can also find in parts of our own country. So, so it goes bigger than just a little project overseas when we do these kinds of things, and I think we all know that. I think we all know that these kinds of initiatives can bring a lot of benefit to not only the people in those communities, but to our own students and the faculty. Here are some of the results. And I've got various reports that we submitted to CIDA. And if you're interested, I can share those with you. I can share with you the original proposal if you want to look at the exhausting work that we had to do to get the project off the ground. But it's now there, you know, and it's intellectual capital that we're willing to share with other schools as we go ahead. So I won't go through each of these individually, but they give a sense of the range of activities that we got involved with. And then some of them are very quantifiable, and some of them are a little bit more qualitative and a little bit more intangible. So where are we now in terms of these communities? And that is really that, you know, the structural poverty still exists in these areas. It's not like we've alleviated poverty and everybody's happy. You know, in some cases, like in the village of Taffin, we had developed 3 homestays by the end of the project. They now have about 6. They have other families that are doing projects around restaurants. We have a wellness tourism project where they've built these tubs and they use herbs and they create these herbal bath experiences for people that come into the community. And you go and you're in this serene, tranquil, fantastic environment, and you're eating local food, which is safe, and you're able to engage in local activities. So for people that are looking for that authentic experience, and that's always a double-edged sword again when we talk about tourism, I think we've tried to keep true to that. However, there's still challenges in tourism development. One is we've basically introduced tourism, we've given them the basic skills, and now they're saying, okay, now we need a marketing plan. And we need a proper business plan because we're going bigger on this front, or we want to expand this out. We need micro loans now in order to expand the opportunities to more villages in the outlying areas. So this is what I mean by uneven development. This is a training project. This wasn't a marketing project, although we got into marketing, although we started to recognize distribution channel issues and address those and work with tour operators in Hanoi. But we didn't have money for building a new market or for building the concrete road that is now running into the community. It's quite bumpy at one point. We don't have any money to address those kinds of issues because bus drivers are saying, I'm not going down there. I'm not bringing my tourists into these communities. And you had an uneven form of development in that you had parts of a community which is sprawled out over a large geographic area on a hillside. There'd be part of it that would be accessible by road, so the bus would go there for an hour visit. And then there are other parts that had the homestays, which were very remote, and that people would go up there and stay for, say, 2 nights. So, of course, those people that were staying for 2 nights were spending money, and there's more money left with those families. The bus that arrives for 2 hours doesn't leave any money. Leaves a lot of garbage. Can leave a lot of problems in that way, but it doesn't necessarily bring in revenue. So the whole idea was to bring people into the community so that they would stay and spend money. So that was the project in a nutshell. The whole issue of dependency, does a community become dependent on tourism, and in tough times like the world recession we're seeing now, and they see a decrease in tourists, have we put them in a difficult position? That is a difficult question to respond to because we can't necessarily predict the future and what will happen. We do know in these areas that we've worked in, we're not trying to create tourism to come in, we're working with tourism that's already there. So that can be an issue, is whether you want to develop tourism in remote areas like the Dutch are and saying, okay, we're going to invest lots, we're going to bring tourists here, or you work in areas that are already impacted by tourism. So that is certainly something to think about when we look at these kinds of issues. I will just leave it there and come back to the original question that I posed. I should also say thanks to Brian. I often do these presentations and have an opportunity to show pictures of Brian throughout. So I'll thank him for that. But I'll also thank him for the guidance that he's provided. We worked on this idea of community tourism initially in Malaysia, in Borneo. We worked in a small community there. We found ourselves working with the septic tank committee as part of a tourism project, right? You think, oh, tourism's all about brochures. Well, actually, no, it's not. So there we are, talking with the Septic Tank Committee about stuff we really didn't know a lot about. And yet it was critical to the community as well as to visitors and their well-being. So thanks, Brian, for all your support along the way. So we have two people here that can speak to what was achieved in Vietnam. And I'll take any questions. Okay.
Yeah.
Any thoughts or questions? Chris?
I've got two. One just sort of more about the question, comment or question about the project, and one sort of perhaps a tangential thing. But you mentioned, and this is something I think I've observed myself when I visited sort of not Southeast Asia, but I've been to places in India and Africa, where you wonder to what extent the culture that you're supposedly coming to see is genuine, and how much it's been sort of created to please the tourists.
Yeah.
Like, you know, this idea that all these communities have their own sort of traditional dress and dances and things like that, and that's all no doubt true that they do, but to what extent are they exaggerated and accentuated for the visitors? Mm-hmm. And what impact does that have if that is indeed a genuine phenomenon? The other question I have, which is a bit more tangential, is I think this is very much about sustainable tourism. I think there's also perhaps something else, sustainability tourism, where people are actually starting to visit places on the basis of sustainable development that is occurring in those locations. I mean, anecdotally, that's certainly occurring locally in places like Dockside Green and the Sioux Nation, and I'm sure it's happening in places like Kerala in India, where they've developed some very sort of interesting ways of dealing with sustainable development that's not tourism, but then people are attracted to that.
So the product is the sustainability that's going on.
And I wonder if you have any sort of take on that from the tourism perspective.
Yeah, well, the latter point, I do think that is occurring. I think people are curious about places that have tried to make it work and that have had some success. So I know that, for example, a place, an eco-lodge that we would go to, Topaz Eco-Lodge, that was funded by the Danish government. It was a development initiative by the Danes. And so they built this eco-lodge with the community with the idea that they would evolve over the years, build up the product, and then hand it over to the community to run. So the community would ultimately own the infrastructure and manage it and operate it. So in the meantime, the Danes are there to teach. So we sent over a student a few years ago to work there, and she taught English and worked at the front desk, and she did a whole bunch of things at this eco-lodge. And I think people go there not only because it's a fantastic view, but because they feel that they're witnessing something quite amazing in this partnership. And so I did see a lot of those kinds of things when I was there, where people were curious and they wanted to see how it was all working.
Is there do you know if there's a literature developing around that from the
That's interesting. I haven't seen any literature developing on that.
Yeah, because it's there's a lot of anecdotal stuff out there, but I've never sort of come across any kind of, if anybody's done any sort of work in that, analysing that.
Well, and what you were talking about earlier, the search for the authentic is the great challenge in tourism, where you have the front of the house and the back of the house. When you think about a community, where there's some things that the community wants you to see, and then there's the actual reality of what's happening. And so it's okay. What is it that is authentic? Is the great debate in tourism, and I have no quick and fast answer. So there's lots of debate, lots of literature on that. I think, though, that when it comes to the community, they're going to decide what they want to share. And I think that's when it goes to saying yes or no, because they'll say, yeah, we'll show you this dance. We're not going to show you these things. If you look at the Aboriginal Tourism Plan here in British Columbia, it has a fantastic conceptual diagram that shows their strategic planning. And in the middle, they basically have culture, values. And this is to be protected, right? And there's certain things we will share, and there's certain things we won't share. And one of the things we won't share is we won't let you tell our story. Verbally tell, because a German guide will come along and say, I can tell this story faster than you can, and we're on a time schedule here. So if you don't mind, local First Nations guy, I'm going to tell the story. And so that becomes one of the things that the Aboriginal tourism folks will say, no, that is, you're commodifying our culture, you're stealing our culture, it's our story to tell. It's our crafts to create.
I guess what it comes down to is who has the control over the interaction.
Sure. That's why, So some things you can regulate, some things that, about coral or crafts being taken away, say, that are not to be taken out of the country. And then maybe some stuff is a little bit more around social conduct of tourists and how they interact.
Yeah.
Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, one of the things about this area, when I got in there with Geoff started all of this, and I was just so pleased to be able to participate. But my immediate sense was, I looked up on the hill and I said, geez, I'd like to go up there, Geoff. Geoff said, well, yeah. Eventually I developed a whole project around working with the national park and biodiversity, which I presented in these forums earlier. The point I would like to make, though, is that when this goes on, you talk about sustainability. Well, there's a demographic sustainability involved in here. All the people that you saw that Geoff was working with were women. Where are the guys? What happened to the men? Where are they? They're not present. Well, when I was up the mountain with UBC Botanical Gardens, and we were doing our botanical research and biodiversity protection process, the guys were with me. But there were black Hmong, and there were porters and guides for the mountain travel. The problem that was run into, because of climate change, what has happened in this area is that they're down to from 3 crops of rice down to 1, 2?
Yeah.
So they've lost their means of support. So what has happened, the young women, when they learn English, they develop a skill which allows them to generate revenue, so the balance of power, the gender balance of power in the communities is shifted to the women, because they now get all the income. They got the language. They're getting trained as guides. So when you actually look at the surface about what has happened, tourism in some respects is sustained. You want to talk about sustainability? Oh yeah, it's sustainable, all right, because climate change has changed the capacity to generate their own food. They were getting subsidized. We're getting sacks of rice in Taffin. And so you've got all these demographic things that have happened as a result of tourism. And really what Geoff was doing with the project, this project was mitigating some of those issues by providing some training and education to provide support.
Yeah.
Is that shift in the power leading to any social tension within the communities?
In terms of, yes.
Sort of the men are perceiving themselves as becoming disempowered, and therefore, I mean, that's in other places around the world that's seen as resulting in social problems and
I think anecdotally we can say that may be occurring. In the Red Zao community, it was actually a matriarchal setting, so the power was held very much by the women in certain cases, so that the household income was essentially looked after by the women. But there was certainly a power change going on, because government officials were coming into the community and they were looking to the women to speak to, but it's a very complex thing, and those are things that I simply was out of my depth. And there's certain things, I think, when you manage these projects, you look to the Vietnamese person, you say, okay, so what's happening now? And are we getting booted out of the country, or is everyone still in love with us, or what's happening? So you had those kinds of situations, and it was almost like trial by error in a way. But I think, you could say that there were some changes in the communities. I think sometimes healthy changes, because the women were saying, actually I can do this, and I do see an opportunity, and I don't want to do what I've done or what my sisters have done, and I want to go this way with a career. So, but it's like with the Prime Directive in Star Trek, which I think is the great tool. You have the best of intentions, and then things go wrong that you didn't see. And you tried to prevent that, or you didn't see it coming, and that was the outcome. My concern is that it has become such a fantastic place to go to that Capilano has continued the project, and the community is becoming more and more fixed on having Canadians there to do the work and to manage the projects. when my hope was that we would be, after 5 years, out of there. Have them for friends for life, but essentially have the project come to a certain degree of conclusion, rather than have us drift in and out and to. So I'm not sure if that's going to be just a small issue for the short term, or if it's going to be a longer term challenge.
What about the research agenda?
Yeah, I don't know. Is there anyone who think that? I know we're running late. It's 1:05. If anyone has a quick thought or anything like that, I'd welcome you to chat with me afterwards. If you want to send an email to me and say, would like to work with the school on the project down the road, I'd welcome it. So thank you very much for your time today.